Okay, so welcome to Conflicts, the Poetics and Politics of Israel Palestine. Actually, that's not the title. That's the title of the book, and the event is Beyond Conflicts and Comparison: A Conversation on Poetics and Politics in Palestine-Israel. Okay, so first I wanted to say welcome and thank you all for coming, and thank you particularly to Liron for traveling and coming here from Irvine. Thank you also to Wajdi, who was also going to participate, and to the co-sponsors of the event, the Center for Jewish History, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and the Department of Comparative Literature. And particularly thank you to Jennifer and Eda, who helped us put the whole thing together. Okay, so the plan for the event is that we do have some kind of a conversation. So in principle, this is an event to note and honor the publication of Liron's book, which I deeply recommend. But we wanted it to be more of also a conversation. So what we'll do is Liron will present the project as a whole for a little bit, and then Wajdi and myself will also put in some maybe further thoughts to open up the discussion or the conversation. And I think I'm going to just read out the bios of everyone who's participating. So Liron Mor is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Director of Critical Theory at the University of California, Irvine. Her research spans the fields of critical and political theory, Hebrew and Arabic literatures, translation, visual studies, and critiques of law, conflict, and colonialism. Mor is particularly interested in local conceptualizations of colonial and racial processes, as you'll see in the book, as expressed in the cultures of Palestine and Israel. She's currently working on a second book project that examines intentionality as a rhetorical, political, and legal racialization mechanism by focusing on the colonial conditions experienced by both Palestinians and Mizrahi Jews. And Wajdi and Mohamed Wajdi Ben Hammed is Assistant Professor of Arabic Literature and Islamic Culture in the Department of Comparative Literature. Wajdi works on modern Arabic literature, thought, with a particular interest in temporality, reception, and theories of Islamic philosophy and Sufism, and literary engagement with neoliberal economy and politics. He's currently working on a book manuscript on Arabic literature post-1967, and the potentialities found in it for a critique of the neoliberal Arab state. I'll present myself in the interest of time. I'm Roni Masel. I teach in comparative literature. I work on Hebrew and Yiddish. I focus mainly on Eastern Europe, though I'm sort of now shifting gears to a new project that focuses on Yiddish in a colonized world and in the global South. Okay, so please welcome Liron.
And hi, I want to thank Roni for the invitation and for putting this together, and thank Jennifer and Eda again for all the labor that goes into these kind of things. Roni, I think you took one of my pages. The first one. Thank you. Always fun to present the project as a whole. Not at all daunting. Okay, so that is the book. I wanted to start by really kind of the main argument of the book, and that is to say that what's going on, including what's going on at present, is not a conflict. What's going on right now, elsewhere I call it inkisam. I talk about it in the last chapter of the book. We can talk about devastation, we can talk about breaking apart, we can talk about it as a time of destruction, of the dissolution of bodies, of communities, of infrastructures, of lives, of everything that sustains those lives. And this is now not only about Gaza and the West Bank, it's also becoming about Lebanon. And so starting from kind of highlighting both the violence and the fact that it is not a conflict. So in everyday speech, when we think about conflict and think about phrases like conflicting narratives or conflicting opinions or aversion to conflict, which is very popular in California in general, isn't it? So when you think about the word conflict in everyday speech, we tend to think of it as an antagonism between two or more elements that are clashing with one another in the same realm and on equal footing. In the context of Palestine-Israel, however, when we employ this term, we bring along this entire dyadic and symmetric, structure, and we thus frame a settlement movement and a colonized people as equivalent competitors over a single strip of land. And we can see the far-reaching repercussions of this kind of framing happening right now. We see related terms like the Israel-Gaza war or the Israel-Hamas war circulating on the news and kind of dictating or molding our reception of the events and implying that this is a war between two equal powers and by so doing erasing the power imbalance between colonizer and colonized. A quick side note that when I say, settlement movement or a colonizing movement, I do not mean it in the moralizing sense. I mean it in the historical and analytic sense. And in fact, it's important to remember that one of the main Zionist institutions named itself in 1924 the Jewish Colonization Association, because colonization is not a pejorative term, but rather it was the way that Zionism understood itself at the time. So I just want to kind of frame the fact that I'm not saying colonizer and colonize as a way of kind of assigning moral blame, but rather we're talking about a history here. So beyond the false symmetry, this term also erases from view other parties that are involved in this context. And I use the word context a lot. It's kind of my way of not saying conflict, so bear with me. But there are European imperial powers, there's the US, and that kind of, when we constantly talk about conflict, that kind of disappears from view. It also erases internal differences amongst both Palestinians and Jews. And I will get into the differences amongst the Palestinian population towards the end of my presentation, but I want to flag that specifically I'm interested in the complexities of the colonial role that is played by Mizrahi Jews, that is Israeli Jews who originate in the Arab and Muslim world. And I'm interested in the way that they're at one at the same time, both colonizers and, to borrow Ella Shochet's term, suffer a semi-colonial condition. For they too were subjected to the forced population transfer, violent social engineering, and cultural suppression dictated by the colonial interests of a settler state. So, one issue with the term conflict is that its two-party narrative is simply inaccurate. But that's just the beginning of the problem. When I started digging into the origins of our perception of political conflict, I also discovered that conflict was imagined beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe in juridical terms specifically. So that it is in fact it assumes in fact not only two parties, but also the tacit external third figure of the judge. And at some point in the book, I suggest that it's even the king judge, because the development of the concept of conflict during the Enlightenment went hand in glove with the development of the concept of the modern state and its sovereignty. So when we think about figures like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when they tried to move away from basing the right of the sovereign on divine right, they ultimately replaced God with conflict as the first cause of sovereign power. If in the Middle Ages sovereignty was justified as a power ordained by God, then in their writing it was justified as a power that protects subjects from the potential re-eruption of the primordial lawless conflict, the state of nature. And it did so, it protected subjects by, according to itself, the role of the ultimate judge to whom all subjects must alienate their right of judgment. And this is Hobbes. I will get back to it and I will get deeper into it very soon, but I just want to flag that in so doing, Western philosophy has established the notion that conflict is the basic condition of politics. and it also couched political conflict in theoretical terms as a legal dispute. There are other ways of thinking of conflict. They were just not going that way. So all this was very abstract, and I think an example can help. This is the example of Sheikh Jarrah. In May 2021, in the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, Palestinian residents were protesting the ongoing Israeli attempts to evict them from their homes. Attempts that really emblematize the kind of continuous process of ethnic cleansing that is happening, specifically in Jerusalem. As happens, a Jewish far-right party named Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, set up shop across the street from the Palestinian protesters, and clashes erupted. And as happens, the Israeli police came in and reacted with hyperbolic force and arrested Palestinians and used tear gas that got into people's homes, etc. So this is the context in which the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement, and this is the statement. Regrettably, the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian terror groups are presenting a real estate dispute between private parties as a nationalistic cause in order to incite violence in Jerusalem. The PA and Palestinian terror groups will bear full responsibility for the violence emanating from their actions. The Israel police will ensure public order is maintained. Okay, so this framing of the events, and this is my argument, is paradigmatic of the Israeli construal of violence and antagonism in Palestine and Israel, and it is also paradigmatic of the normative meaning of political conflict more broadly. So when we here talk about political conflict, we kind of have this in mind. This statement translates the clashes along with their various facets. So we had systemic colonialism, ethnic cleansing, police violence, national struggle, local resistance. All of those are different aspects of what happened there. And all of those get translated into a legal dispute between two parties vying over real estate in a zero-sum game. Because all the main building blocks of the normative concept of conflict are here, and these are, oh my God, I'm so used to teaching and the keyboard being here. It's like, okay. Private parties, legal dispute, real estate, and violence. Those are the building blocks. This statement is useful in elucidating the key meanings and effects of this theoretical political concept. Also, when I wrote theoretical political, I didn't think about the fact that I will have to say it out loud, and it's so annoying. Thank you, past me. Okay, so I'm going to start with dispute. A dispute convenes the parties in a tribunal, in a legal rather than a social arena, where a decision is expected. The rhetoric of litigation is also suggestive, of two parties with equal legal claims and responsibilities, and so it generates that dyadic logic and false symmetry that I've already critiqued before. The notion of legal dispute is also eschatological. It mortgages the present for the sake of a future decision, a final judgment that may or may not materialize. In this sense, conflict resolution, or what is called conflict resolution, is itself a mode of conflict management. By depicting present conditions as a neutral starting point for negotiation, and as merely temporary, and therefore as legally acceptable, at least for now, it whitewashes and facilitates the ongoing colonization, its asymmetry, and its violence. Okay, there's more. So, as the ministry's statement implies, this theoretical concept of conflict fixes the dispute specifically on real estate. And so it frames the zero-sum antagonism as a clashing, specifically, over the right to possess, exploit, and occupy a territory. The land, which prior to colonization was thought of as shared, as a gathering, grazing ground for communal use. And it sounds Orientalist when I say this, but because of the Tanzimat, because of the Ottoman reforms that happened halfway through the 19th century, lands were kind of held collectively in Palestine. So this land that was thought of as collective is here repackaged as property and considered as a delimited and enclosed space whose habitation and use are necessarily exclusive. By centering on property and its law, conflict suggests an antagonism not only between two parties, but also between two, and only two, models of violence or of conflictuality. This dual perception of conflict is the legacy of that long philosophical tradition that I've mentioned. You can call it liberalism, you can call it the Enlightenment, depending on context. And in this tradition, conflict has typically been portrayed in one of two interrelated ways. On the one hand, owing to such thinkers as Hobbes and Rousseau, conflict is perceived as a pre-political war, as that state of nature. And it is envisioned as inspiring universal and chaotic violence, precisely because property, real estate, is not yet safeguarded. And everyone has, and this is Hobbes, a right to all things. So lawless conflict over property serves as the ultimate justification for the juridical binding of the community in the universal of the state and its laws. So if on the one hand we have this pre-political, chaotic, illegal violence, on the other hand we have the state, which is contracted to protect exclusive property and is related this time to political conflict. That is, to war as a legal competition over territories and its sublimation as a zero-sum juridical dispute between opposed camps. This logic culminates in the decision and thought of Carl Schmitt, which also invokes the possibility of the enemy becoming internal and of violence becoming law-preserving in the form of the police. Western political philosophy has regularly used the threat of the pre-political form of conflict, with its aimless, lawless violence, to justify the second, legal conflict, as the only acceptable model for political conflict. Going back to Palestine, this juridical political concept of conflict constructs clashes in Palestine-Israel as an opposition not only between two parties, but also between pre-political, illegal, private violence and authorized state violence that enforces juridical order. In this schema, the Palestinian Authority, the representative body of the Palestinians in the West Bank at the very least, is equated with terrorist groups, transforming basically all Palestinian actors into terrorists, which is another way of saying, those whose violence is necessarily unlawful or beyond the pale of politics. This is how people use the term terrorist. And then on the other hand, we have Israeli law enforcement that is only trying to restore public order. It does so by the use of violence, obviously, but there's no mention of that violence over here, right? Like it's completely disavowed and invisible, and moreover, it's legal because it's police's violence. This is also known as the state's monopoly over violence. Okay, so the language of legal dispute sustains the colonial status quo with its forever deferred decision by criminalizing political opposition. It outlaws actions that challenge the current state of affairs, painting such actions as a refusal to accept the allegedly objective rules of the juridical game by attempting to force a decision through extrajuridical means. And this could be BDS, and it could be demonstrations or appeals to international law. What the case of Sheikh Jarrah makes abundantly clear, however, is the fact that the law is not an impartial, universal common sense. Rather, it is always written in the idiom of those in power. Despite repeated appeals to the law in different courts and from different legal angles, Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah were unable to secure the right to live in their own homes. This failure is structural rather than incidental. Israeli law permits Jews to reclaim homes that they own, especially in East Jerusalem, prior to 1948, while depriving Palestinians of the same exact right. A few dozen Jewish settlers are thus entitled to a kind of right of return to Sheikh Jarrah that is denied to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. So this is what I say in the book. But I think that the same rhetoric of conflict is replicated these days during the current war. I've already mentioned that it is evident in the name that mainstream media has chosen for this war, which creates a false sense of symmetry and all of that. It's also evident in discussions of the day after for Gaza, where Gaza is featured as real estate. And it is perhaps most evident in the line repeatedly drawn between legal and illegal violence. So this is one example from the ICJ hearing, where Israeli representatives argued that the applicant, South Africa, is essentially asking the court to substitute the lands of armed conflict between a state and a lawless terrorist organization with the lens of a so-called genocide of a state against a civilian population. Israel is committed, as it must be, to comply with the law, but it does so in the face of Hamas's utter contempt for the law. It is committed, as it must be, to demonstrate humanity, but it does so in the face of contempt. You get the point. So there is definitely this repeat 3 times rhetorically. There's an attempt here to draw the line between legal and illegal violence, right? So those are the 2 lenses that were given here. There's the lens of genocide and the lens of an armed conflict between a state and a lawless terrorist organization. So why not just talk about genocide and solve the problem in this way? And I think it is important to talk about genocide. And if there's time during the conversation, I'm happy to talk about it some more and also give you my my misgivings about using these terms, including the fact that, the bar is just so high that it's a bit of a useless juridical concept. It's being based on a European exceptional case just means no one else could ever get there. And that's just part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that, it doesn't address everything that happens throughout all of Palestine or to all of Palestinians. And it also does not address things that happened prior to October 2023. Or maybe it does, I don't know. But the question here is what terms we use to talk about these things. And I feel like genocide falls short. Terms like genocide, apartheid, and transfer, as well as their cousins, colonialism, occupation, and siege, are all incredibly valuable. They're urgent terms. Like, we need them to better understand what's going on in Palestine, and especially to better understand Israeli policies and violence. Yet they're insufficient. None of these largely imported prisms fits perfectly with what happens in Palestine-Israel or is specific enough to this context. Additionally, these conceptual prisms only pertain to Israeli modes of oppression and dispossession, and not so much to Palestinian actions or epistemologies. And perhaps most importantly, they offer only partial frames. Each of these frameworks often attends to the structure of oppression of only one segment of the Palestinian population, according to the modes of Israeli control that are prevalent amongst that segment. These frames perpetuate and reinforce the colonial division lines drawn in 1948, 1967, 1993, and 2007 because they keep dividing the Palestinian population according to Israeli modes of control. This partiality is not coincidental, or, as people say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And it's a key feature of the form of control exercised by Israel. I argue in the book that it's a form that operates to a large degree by fragmenting Palestinian society along those colonial lines that I've mentioned, and by rendering unpredictable the specific manifestation of its own power in different times and places. One might argue that this combinatory and fracturing mode of control is in fact intentional, guaranteeing its own endurance and open-endedness. If articulating the problem is impossible, then confronting or even redefining it is out of the question. In the book, I call this fracturing mode of control inqisam, and it is one of the 5, 6, 7, alternative concepts of conflictuality that I try to offer in the book based on literature and a little bit of television and film. And the point is kind of to refuse the gravitational pull of conflict, particularly as a juridical and a political concept, and to try to veer the attention to aesthetics, history, the everyday, and see what actual local, culture has to say about the way things operate. And it was particularly important to me to try to not only find new terms for Israeli forms of oppression, but also for the way Palestinians are experiencing them and the way that they're resisting. And so at least some of the concepts in the book try to do that. I'm going to stop here and I look forward to the conversation part. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you all for being here. It's Thank you, Roni, for organizing this fantastic event, and Mor to be with us. It's hard times and it's tough to talk about things, these matters, and to find the words beyond just personal emotions, but also public protocols of how to properly speak about things. And I think your book cuts into the heart of that, to talk to us, to give us the opportunity to think with local terms what's going on. So in my response, commentary about the book, I will be both talking a little bit about some of the overarching arguments that you make, but also give a couple of examples of local terms, because I think that's where the prose of the book too, the idea that we need to go and look on the ground on local metaphors to make sense of what's going on. So I'll use two examples from an impressive array that you give us in your chapters. So for Professor Liron Mor's book is both an insightful intervention in the context of the literatures and politics of Palestine-Israel, and a timely intervention for where we stand. To my mind, it is timely in two senses. First, it helps us understand some of the historical processes that have led to the ongoing destruction of Gaza, which we are witnessing live, and the decimation of the West Bank. I should remind our audience we are in day 348 of a horrific onslaught on Gaza, on the Gaza Strip, whose civilian population has suffered through 17 years of siege and 4 major military campaigns in the previous 2 decades. Mor's intervention is also timely, so that's the first sense of being timely, in the sense of giving us the historical background that led to where we are in the now. It's timely in the second sense, in direction us towards the future. So Mor's intervention is also timely in the second sense. It provides a reading into the core impasses that make a future of coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis currently blocked and endlessly deferred. A central mechanism of perpetuating this violence and deferral is the framing of political strife in Palestine-Israel as a case of conflict between two political bodies, two equal forces, two irreconcilable peoples, two stubborn religions, and so on and so forth. Instead, Mor describes a set of interlocking colonial realities that include the liquidation of Gaza, the occupation and expropriation of land in the West Bank, the legal apartheid system in Israel, the racialization of Arabs, Arab Jews, and Palestinians inside and outside Israel, and the division of labor created between them that is meant to divide them and pit them against each other. To understand these colonial realities, Mor urges us to reject the convenient simplifications that the language of conflict produces. For one, the notion of conflict allows Western administrations who are deeply responsible for the coloniality of the situation to present themselves as brokers of peace, as judges between two competing parties. Instead, Mor directs us to a local set of terms and their elaboration in narrative, poetic, and cinematic texts to make sense of the realities on the ground in Palestine-Israel. These terms include ishtibak, clashing engagement, so this is chapter 1, where it's centered on the work of Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian novelist. Livatim, disorienting dilemmas, which examines the oeuvre of the Israeli writer Haim Hazzaz. Ikhtifa, disappearance, which examines a number of very canonical texts in Palestinian literature, from Emil Habibi, recent texts as well, Ibtisam Azam, to film Ilya Suleiman. Hawk, mediating law, which is focused on the poetry of the Israeli poetess Dalia Ravikovich. And Inqisam, finally, the severance of Palestinian communities, but also the racialization of Palestinians and Arab Jews inside Israeli society, Mizrahi Jews, or Mizrahi Jews of Arab predecessors, or hailing from Arabic countries. Israeli, and that final chapter is focused on the Israeli TV show Fawda. So I will focus my remarks on Mor's analysis of the concept of disappearance, ikhtifa, and hostile severance, inqisam, as indigenous Arabic terms that refer to the concrete political realities on the ground in Israel, Palestine, but also as local metaphors that are helpful for us to think beyond the false symmetries of the discourse of conflict management. As Mor insists in her book, what follows from the juridico-political concept of conflict in its liberal dominant form is the notion of a rational judgment between private agents of contractual rights what you have beautifully explained to us. What this abstracted legal image obfuscates is the, quote, colonial parameters of judgment in its historical enactment and the false analogies in its making which present states of domination as states of competition between rival parties. The metaphor of disappearance strikes at the heart of regimes of judgment based on the false equivalences of conflict. اختفاء, disappearance, has been an abiding theme in Palestinian poetry, narrative, and film. Mor's analysis of this theme centers on a number of key Palestinian texts from Emil Habibi's 1974. The English title is The Secret Life of Said ibn Optimist, but the Arabic title is Al-Waqa' al-Gharib al-Ikhtifa' Said Abu Nahs, which is the strange circumstances of the disappearance of Said ibn Optimist. To Ilya Suleiman's 2002 film, Chronicle of a Disappearance. The more recent novel by Ibtisam Azim entitled Sifr al-Ikhtifa', Epistle of Disappearance or Book of Disappearance as it's translated by Sinan Anto. In Palestinian political vocabulary, disappearance is of course genealogically tied to the Nakba of 1948 and the expulsion of over 750,000 Palestinians from their villages. It is also related, as Mor explores in her book, to ongoing processes, what commentators have called the ongoing Nakba, that includes waves of land appropriation, ever-expanding settlements, and returning our gaze to Gaza, the recent plans of displacing the over 2 million civilians to the Egypt's Sinai Desert. I mean, just circulated around and toyed with for a while and then left behind. Facing these realities, the writer Emil Habibi dramatized a Palestinian anti-hero who complies with the demands of Israeli military governance. In fact, in the novel, he's both an informer and a union buster. So he's fully presenting his services to the authorities. And yet he's so constantly hunted and continually displaced that he decides one day to disappear with extraterrestrials that he encounters. And we don't know if that's actually a real twist at the end, but also it ends with the writer disavowing the story and saying these are letters I found in the bison about a person who went mad, basically. So it's both. In that sense. So more recently, after Said, the Optimist 1974, that was published. More recently, the Palestinian writer Ibtisam Azim imagines a world in which the Israeli public wakes up one day to find all Palestinians living in Israel as well as in the West Bank and Gaza have disappeared. The novel explores the anxieties, reliefs, apathies, and fantasies, as well as torments of Israeli society in the aftermath, and its equally also its disruptions, given that its cheapest labor force is no longer present. What these Palestinian texts do is to center the theme of disappearance and locate it between, on the one hand, major historical traumas, which are constantly denied. I mean, the Palestinian Nakba is only in the previous 3 decades that it's been discussed and allowed into public discourse. And on the other hand, so between those historical experiences of disappearance, and on the other hand, the ever-present fantasy of a colonial order, that of the total disappearance of indigenous society. As Mor reminds us, these texts work against ongoing juridical, administrative, and military efforts to make the disappearance disappear and to make the erasures erased. And she mentions this is from the absentee property law of 1950, which made the properties of displaced Palestinians under the control of the state of Israel, to more recent, even 2018 nation-state law, revoking Arabic as an official language of Israel. Further, the disappearing of Palestinians within frameworks of conflict management brokered by the supposedly impartial judges of the United States and Europe serves as a means to likewise disappear the uniquely European culpabilities that gave rise to Zionism and to reify the invention of the category of Judeo-Christian civilization and to disappear the long histories of Judeo-Islamic coexistence. Liron Mor urges us to think also of disappearing along with the processes of inqisam, hostile severance, another local metaphor, and its regimes of invisibilization which divide between Palestinian and Israeli citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and between Arab Jews, Mizrahi Jews, and their Arabic cultural identities. These processes of severance are not separate realities, They are built, as she tells us, on epistemologies of colonial racialization. The dominant Zionist narrative defined Israel as the extension of European civilization in the Middle East, whose Arab populations, Muslims, Christians, but also Jewish, represented civilizational inferiors. From this position, they developed a colonial administrative policy consistent in the denationalization of Palestinians inside Israel, always defined as Arabs, not Palestinian, denationalizing them, but also the de-Arabization of Mizrahi Jews, the renunciation of the cultural identities and heritages of their forefathers. And their settlement also, as an administrative tactic, their settlement in buffer zones as a protective shield against Palestinian communities. Hostile severance as an ongoing colonial reality of land appropriation and fragmentation of complex divisions across racial, religious, and national lines of the militarization of conflict resolution through new technologies of surveillance and punishment finds its expression in contemporary Palestinian art through the dramatization of the military checkpoint. Mor discusses Adenia Shibli's novella التلاعب بالعديد من ذرات الغبار, Playing with the Specks of Dust, which depicts how the checkpoint fragments not only space and time, but also people, and instilling in them an individualist logic of survival. One might add to the local lexicon of inqisam another term, shatat, the scattering, which refers to the millions of Palestinians scattered in refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries and in diaspora, and their dreams of return to an independent Palestinian state. Liron Mor's book, Conflicts, is a timely work because it urges us to recognize that the end of colonial forms of rule is the only path to genuine coexistence. This coexistence begins by naming a colonial situation as colonial, and by recognizing the local terms through which subjugated people make sense of their struggles. By way of conclusion, I like to extend the image of severance and qisam that Mor uses, and also add to it a contrasting image of redeployed alliances and renewed solidarities. First, in terms of expanding the image of inqisam, severance. The ongoing war on Gaza demonstrated new regimes of severance, not only in relation to Western political classes, which were always involved actors in the realities of disappearance and the coloniality of the situation, but also the severance of the question of Palestine from the concerns of certain Arab governments. I'm referring here to the role played by Egypt, Jordan, and Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, in abetting the ongoing onslaught on Gaza. That's another regime of inqisam and severance in relationship to those states. In a way, this role is unsurprising, considering the undemocratic and self-serving nature of these governments, but it's always nonetheless shocking. On the other hand, in the past year, we witnessed new alliances and breakages, from student protests to global South solidarity movement, from for instance, South Africa in front of the ICJ, to the numerous Latin American diplomatic campaigns. These solidarities remind us, once again, that the issue of Palestine is ever viewed by different publics of the global South as the reenactment of their own historical tragedies, only this time it is televised. And as a final, I have a number of questions that we can open up together, but maybe appropriate place to start, to begin, is with the end, the postscript, and where I quote you, you said, the note that you hope the concepts you elaborate can perhaps resonate with other contexts, people, and cultures. So do you find in the previous months and waves of solidarity that's happening, like some of those kinds of resonances, also in terms of anti-colonial, not just anti-colonial alliances, but also continuation of colonial dilemmas and colonial indeterminacies? So do we see even in the previous months some of those kinds of correspondences? And I have other questions in terms of the use. You have beautiful sections on metaphor and the role that metaphor does, that in order to unsettle judgment and the need of judgment for clear-cut categories and false analogies. And I remember a part where you quote Locke, and Locke said, metaphor is the enemy of judgment, because metaphor conflates things and collapses two things, and in order to judge, we need to break apart things in order that analogical type of thinking. And you ask us to stay with the metaphor, to remain with the local metaphor, because that is the path to understand And in the text, you even draw a metaphor in the Arabic tradition, which is the term majaz, which means a boundary crossing. The metaphor in the rhetorical tradition of Arabic as a crossing of a limitation of seeing. It's the metaphor that will allow you to see, as opposed to judgment and law, and metaphor is what confuses you. And so I invite you also to elaborate there on the role that metaphor does for you. And thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah, so like Wajdi, I too am kind of very drawn to those alternative figurations that you give us in the book, alternatives to conflict, and I would focus on those relating to Hebrew literature, and to the book's intervention in scholarship on Hebrew literature and discourse on the Israeli cultural imagination. So in exploring the poetics and politics of Palestine-Israel, Liron Mor's book treats literature, poetics, not as representational or referential, but as an active agent, complicit in violence and reality, or otherwise operating in response to it. And this is kind of one of the main things that I find most useful and productive in this book. So in the few minutes that I have, I'd like to focus on the book's significant contribution to our ability to assess how Hebrew literature and the Israeli cultural imagination is both constituted by reality, obviously, and operational within it. Yeah, how literature operates and activates. Or in Mor's words, when writing about the Palestinian author Hassan Kanafani in chapter 1, the question is how to understand Hebrew literature, and this is a quote, far from being a vehicle for broadcasting performed political ideas and positions, is in fact the medium within which they are figured, they are created and fashioned and produced. This quote is reserved in the book for describing the politics of Kanafani, his work and his commitment to effecting concrete resistance, which was encapsulated in the phrasing of his obituary that, and this is a quote not from the book, or in the book as well, but from the obituary, that, quote, his weapon was a ballpoint pen and his arena the newspaper pages. Yeah, so literature as in itself an act of political action. I'm interested in this image because of its parallels in Hebrew literature. For instance, in the famous line by the poet Avraham Shlonsky, a modernist poet, who fashions himself a paitan solel be'Israel, or poet paver, poet road paver, in the land of Israel. In other words, because of the role that the canon of Hebrew literature fashioned for itself as not only representing the project of settlement, of settling the land, but as actively facilitating it, creating the cultural figurations and material machination that will effect the expropriating, displacing, and transplanting, or in Shlonsky's terms, will allow these mechanisms that will allow for paving the land, building over it, covering it over. And here I'm thinking with Hannah Kornfeld, who's taught us to pay attention to how the figure of the land as a naked woman operates in Hebrew literary imagination. So an important contribution of Liron Mor's book in this regard is demonstrating how Hebrew literature allows not only the figuration for colonial action, but also its procedures of justifying and erasing the violence of that coloniality, right? So both retroactively and prospectively. Theorizing from within, theorizing from the local terminology. Chapter 2 of the book highlights the figure of levatim, an ongoing indecision that will strive for a decision that still strives for a decision that will have always never come. Right, as the root lavat, levatim, is often used in a grammatical form, hitlabtut, that connotes a reflexive, indeterminate, and ever-recurring action. So this is sort of an ongoing not making one's mind, which in itself is sort of aimed still with that kind of imagination, the legalistic, juridical imagination of coming to a decision, finally making a decision over that real estate dispute, but a sort of decisionism that will never come. Scholars of Hebrew literature have long noted the resurfacing of ambivalence, uncertainty, and hesitation in Hebrew literature, the Hebrew literature of revival starting in the late 19th century. And many sought to identify in it, in these ambivalences, a mode of critique or resistance to the Zionist project. But by focusing on the operation of Levatim as a cultural figure, however, the book shows, or Liron shows, how the Israeli imagination in fact relies on such personal qualms, doubts, ambivalences. Through this decisionist indecision, Hebrew literature creates characters and persona that live in the mind of the Israeli cultural imagination and functions there as ultimate moral defenders, as perpetual alibis, as if reminding, yes, we did feel conflicted, yes, we did have morals, yes, we were appalled at this or that. Yeah. Furthermore, the role of those figures is to forever inhabit the Israeli political sphere, not only as a claim to morality. Lost my place on the page. Yes, but not only as a claim to morality for the preservation of an Israeli sense of moral standing, but their role is also to function as a court and a legal system. In parallel with Israel's military courts that from time to time assume the role of adjudicating events of exceptional cruelty, and typically these are events that receive global international attention through the media. So like those courts that from time to time decide that it is all of a sudden their role to try to arrive at some kind of a justice, so too Hebrew literature is entrusted with adjudicating similar events, framing them as exceptions, as actions by rotten apples, expressing a humanist indignation or alternately a sentimentalist invocation of a diasporic Jewish morality as a form of partial critique of Israeli brutality. Critically, however, the main effect of both such indignation and the evocation of Jewish ethics in response to these exceptional cases is also the justification of the ongoing, presumably unexceptional reality of violence, brutality, and dispossession in Palestine. It seems particularly urgent right now, at least to me, to locate alternative figurations of dissent rather than indecision, beyond hollow analogies that subsume the case and the cause for Palestine under other causes, beyond sentimentalism or indignation at the exception as the exception that serves to justify the rule. Conflicts. Liron's book gives us the case of Dalia Rabikovich, whose poetry works to expose and inscribe, exposing the facade of the military courts and inscribing authority of judgment instead in the pained body and the specificity of a Palestinian town, in blood as intimate relationship and as brutal injury. Her poetry also points us to the possibility of articulating a specifically Jewish mode of resistance to Zionist courts and military force by relying on a Yiddish tradition of lament and lullaby while not using it to absolve the self of responsibility. So so in this, Rabikovich might have been responding, this is a speculation, to articulation of indignation in Yiddish poetry. So there's this corpus of Yiddish poetry that is written in the 1950s and 60s after the Nakba and expressing all different kinds of critique of the events. And I'm thinking specifically about a poem by Yankel Blattstein, a poem on the massacre in the Palestinian village of Kibia in 1953 by the IDF. And this is a translation by Adi Malalel. Anger, this is just a bit from the poem. Anger, revenge, smoke, a small camp with murder in their eyes, girded with bow and arrow, in the treachery of night. My brothers, right? He's writing this in Yiddish, speaking to the idea of soldiers. My brothers annihilated the mercy within and defiled the parchment of my life, defiled my God of the patient study house. It is difficult to forgive such devilish bravery. So he's invoking here a certain kind of sense of Yiddish, Jewishly inflected morality, and I do wonder if Ravikovich sees in that a sort of absolving by invoking diasporic past that is already for Gladstein's moment irrelevant with the summation of Eastern European Jewry during the Holocaust. Instead, Ravikovich's model, as elucidated here in Mor's work, could be said to operate in parallel lines to another Yiddish writer, Avron Karpinovich, whose short story Don't Forget was recently translated into English by Shachar Pinsker. And I'll say just a few words about the story and what I mean when this maybe is an alternative model. The story questions trite analogies, as Liron Mor's book does. We see in this story a Jewish soldier who's a Holocaust survivor and his captive, a Palestinian man. The soldier survivor, whose perspective guides the story, oscillates between seeing his captive as his own reflection, so this analogy of the sufferer of the Palestinian as the sufferer of the exilic Jew, and at the same time seeing in him the Germans who killed his own mother. Right? Then he kind of moves between these analogies. When the soldier, but the story ends in what Hanan Hevel has termed Zionism as an act of revenge. When the soldier survivor, covered in the blood of his captive, remains with the empty and persistent leftovers of revenge and shattered subjectivity. As the trite analogies collapse, we remain with the reality of devastation, a reality to which, as Mor's book guides us, we must turn our attention. So I want to maybe end with this question of alternative models and alternative figurations. Whether you think you see Ravikovich as offering us something that is useful, if you have have come across other such figurations, and specifically in the past year. So I know that the book was completed and already in production when the war broke out, and obviously a lot has been written since, and I wonder what kind of figurations, both in Palestinian and in Jewish writing globally and in Palestine and Israel, what kind of figurations we, or any of us in the room, have been able to spot as a way, as an analytic into understanding what's going on, as an analytic, as the book urges us to do, an analytic that's anchored in the localities and the cultural imagination and figuration of Palestine and Israel. Okay.
Thank you. That's a lot. I'm trying to think where to start. So I'll start with your last question because it's most in my head. The question of alternative modes of criticism or dissent that are happening now. I'll start with Ravikovich, and with the fact that on the one hand, it's nice to speak about her here because I got interested in her because of Hana, and so like for me it's kind of like
Homecoming.
yeah, full circle, kind of her full circle. So I thought that I'm going to find in her poetry something that is the quintessential form of criticism that goes beyond levatim or goes beyond shooting and crying, the kind of criticism that Roni described, that is just kind of allowing Zionism to keep on going by performing self-criticism. And, I kind of felt like the two things in Rabikovich that come close to doing that. One is the attachment to the body and its in its specificity, and the other one is a formula in one of her poems, Anilo Khan, I am not here, which is kind of like decolonization in a nutshell, but it's also a paradoxical phrase. Like, no one can say, I am not here, right? If you index a here, then you have to be in that here, right? So the kind of allowed a way of talking about how paradoxical and impossible for her, in a sense, decolonization is, but that is kind of like the telos of I guess, real dissent or criticism. And then trying to bring this to today, I'm dismayed at the amount of absence of criticism and dissent amongst Jewish Israeli society. I feel like in the West too, there's this great struggle to articulate something beyond the demonstration of being appalled and objecting to what's going on. The one thing that feels to me, kind of new right now is the kind of citizen reporting that we see coming out of Gaza. And I don't think we've ever seen this scale of violence in such intimate detail and, in kind of this everydayness of it. Like, there's something new about everyone having a camera in an event of this magnitude of violence. So, some of you might remember 9/11. There was still censorship. People did not have phones, and no one saw those bodies up close. And so there's something very different happening right now with these new technologies. And I think this kind of those reporters on Instagram and TikTok that a lot of us have been following are doing something similar to Rabikovich, like interest in the body, and they're showing us those specificities, and something is happening. Those specificities actually work. It feels like public opinion in the West is being affected, and like something about specific bodies, about children, about the everyday lives of a 19-year-old woman reporter in Gaza actually starts resonating with people in a way that I didn't see before. So I would say that kind of, I don't have a name for it. Citizen reporting is kind of like not getting at it enough. But there is something about the up close Instagram, way we're kind of seeing what's happening there that changes things. I don't know. I'm not a very optimistic person, so I can't be like, hey, and now we have dissent and criticism and everything is great. But it is a moment where I see a connection between the poetry I talk about in the book and what's going on now. Okay. And that, in a sense, is also an answer to your question about
speaking to it too. Yeah.
About resonances, and what's going on with the protests today. Okay. I will say so. So, Elias Khoury, the Lebanese author, passed away 2 days ago, and about 11 years ago, in 2013, Palestinians in east of Jerusalem, in an area known as E1 by Israel, built this protest encampment, and they named it Baba Shams after Khoury's novel by the same name. And that was a hopeful moment. Like, that was a moment where, I remember thinking, oh, maybe the third Intifada will be this amazing cultural thing where people would just return. They'll return to, Palestinians will just return. They'll create those villages. Baba Shams wasn't the only one. There was a similar thing happening with the Krit, Palestinian village in the Galilee inside, 48 Israel. So it was a moment where tent protests were appearing, and they seemed to be enacting the kind of future that young Palestinians were seeing for themselves. They got tired of negotiations and conflict resolution and conflict. They were just like, let's just do it. And so that is the main resonance actually in my head when I see student tent protests right now. Obviously, we can think about Occupy, and we can think about there were other tent protests.
Sorry, it just made me think of the Great March of Return 2018. It was called The Four by Ahmed Abu Ratima, who's a Palestinian poet. And it mobilized civil society in Gaza for, the March of Return.
For 3 years.
For 3 years. And we know later this military suppression of it, the complete devastation of the civilian protests, marchers in their march. And the lack of also, maybe to go back to that kind of the Levatim aspect on a global scale always going, the lack of concern for the Great March of Return, 2018, 2019, a lot of people in the Western public opinion don't even know about it.
That's true.
Yeah. As extending that, having that becomes kind of metaphor.
Yeah. I also just wanted to add that between, Roni, you talked about Levatim, and Wajdi, you talked about Ikhtifa. And I really just wanted to mention that in my head, the one leads to the other. That there is something so solipsistic and self-involved in Levatim, like this idea of this self-criticism and internal contradictions that just end up facilitating Zionism. And it's a literary phenomenon. It's out of control. Like in pre-state Hebrew literature, it's just like this hesitation is kind of like endless, and there's so much of it. And it's true that it's kind of just it happens in other national literatures around that time, but at the same time there is something kind of disproportional of it. And what's interesting and specific to Hebrew literature with that is that the people who are writing this literature are also sometimes politicians. So if Ishal Smilansky is writing an indecisive protagonist who takes a Palestinian prisoner and doesn't know whether to stop the abuse of the prisoner and intervene or not, and the entire short story is about this hesitation: should I intervene? Should I not intervene? And of course, he doesn't intervene; he doesn't do anything. But then Smilansky himself was part of the Israeli parliament. He voted against ending the military rule on Palestinians. He basically arrogated to his narrator the job of criticizing and being, liberal and having kind of
a human
objection.
sensibility.
Yes, some kind of, objecting to what's going on, but not doing anything about it. And, with the other hand, at the same time, was kind of pushing forward with Zionism as a hierarchical exclusive system. And this, this mode of kind of just being so concerned with one's self-image is something that leads to the psychological, let's say, disappearance of Palestinians. Or rather, in the book, I kind of say that disappearance seems to be the way that Palestinians are experiencing this Levatim, this way that they're being overlooked actually in this entire business. And disappearance also felt like my only historical discovery ever. Like literature goes, we don't get to have like historical discoveries, but I was like, it's everywhere in Palestinian literature. It's literally everywhere, and particularly in the literature of 48ers, 48 Palestinians. So it really gets to the heart of Palestinian experience, and you're right, it's mostly about the actual expulsion. But I also found that it's, about the experience of being a Palestinian in Israel, which is, a lot of it is being made invisible in a complex sense, not just like, people, there's discrimination. But the term used for Palestinians in Israel, which is, the Arabs of Israel. It's not even Israeli Arabs. It's the Arabs of Israel. Is really helpful in understanding this disappearance, because what it does is other Palestinians, they're Arabs, they're not Israelis, they're Arab Israelis. So they are othered, but at the same time, they're not allowed to appear as Palestinians. Arab is a generic term; it's not a national term. So so it kind of invisibilizes Palestinian identity while at the same time segregating Palestinians, making them into an other. And that is something that I was trying to get to with this concept of disappearance, that there is, it's not just the expulsion, it's also the kind of segregation and, trying to cover over or make invisible, that then becomes also useful for exploitation in terms of labor.
And even historically, they always arrive at the scene disappeared already. Even if you go in,
yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
Like the longest time it took to recognize the Palestinians and their histories and their region. They always arrive in Western discourse, and the political realities creates disappearance. Sorry.
Always, so like Ilyas Anbar has this interview where he says, that 48 had to happen from the start as though the Palestinian has already disappeared. And that, basically Zionists had to vacate Palestinians from their head even though they rubbed shoulders with them. Which is, and this is what I'm getting at, this was the last thing that I was interested in with disappearance, and that's the psychological aspect of Israelis and how is it possible to ignore a person you're rubbing shoulders with? And I think, and bring it back to today, I talk about the disappearance of the disappearance or the repression of the repression. Like, I think that is very much characteristic of what's going on in Israeli society at the moment, which is to say, not that nothing is going on, that would be, repression, but to say that there is nothing to repress, that we already know everything there is to know. We don't need to learn more about it. And in that way, kind of, repressing the fact that we repress allows people to keep on going. And some people, there's differences between liberal and illiberal. But in both cases, there is this kind of reaction of, we already know, but they deserve it, but there's no other way, Hamas, So I just kind of wanted to end on that because it felt, it really helped me understand what's going on, especially the first few months after October 7. Yeah. Sorry, it might have sounded a bit vague. I will try to.
Not at all vague. So I think maybe I'd like to open it to the audience, but maybe before I do, I'll grab the mic while I have it. Thinking just with what you said about citizen reporting, I wonder about technology or some kind of figuring out how technology works here as a figuration, because obviously technology is also a main aspect of Israeli control.
Yeah.
And ongoing the AI and the surveillance and the economy of warfare technology that Israel relies on. So, and at the same time, that sort of like TikTok reporting, there is some kind of twinning here that I wonder how that works.
Just throwing it out there. This little question of technology.
No, I'm just saying. To me, it's like also still too vague to conceptualize.
Okay, I'll say something. Thank you all so much. Wait through that wonderful thought. I thought, well, one of the questions like what's going on today just made me think, well, literature-wise, it's kind of too hard. Everybody's too caught up. Well, but I was curious if there is. And
there is.
Okay. Because that would be, I'd love to hear. And I did, there is a group of Swana youth now that are having events, and they have this big Muna and brought a poet from Hazak. Would you know that? Yes, so Yahya Ashur, who's written, he was here in the US rather, something, and then got stuck here basically. And so they raised money for his family, but and his poetry was just really powerful. And its book is called A Gaza Siege Genocide. And I can even send you, just beautiful, very powerful work that's sort of all I could feel like I could do from here. And, background fundraising from the book events.
So I was trying to look up something on the internet, forgetting that I'm not connected to the internet here. But yes, there's poetry coming out of Gaza. That's just like a heartbeat. It never stops. But there was also an interesting thing that happened on the side of Hebrew literature where, so what I was trying to look at is like what month that was, and I think it was November or December already, that Joshua Cohen, who wrote the Netanyahu's, collaborated with an Israeli author to create a collection of short stories. And the collection is called Miklat, which is both refuge and a bomb shelter. And, within a month or two of the beginning of the war, there were already these literary responses. And I mean, they did nothing in terms of processing. Like, it was too soon. Like, there wasn't much there, but it felt like a form of propaganda. And again, Hebrew literature was participating in this, you can call it lebatim or you can just call it propaganda, but to produce something so soon, and in both Hebrew and English. So it was clearly intended for international audience. You can find it. It's in English. There were a couple of projects like that, so yeah.
But not of dissent.
There was some Yiddish poetry of this end.
It's like a heartbeat. It's all the time.
Right.
It's translated into English if anyone is interested.
I have a question. I wonder, when we talk about resistance and the resistance movement in Palestine, including the resistance event on October 7th, basically my question is, do they understand that as conflict? If Palestinian resistance, because many things they did on October 7th were, very impressive and effective, targeting surveillance operations and, diversions and things like that. So if there is a resistance movement that is, doing big things, do you think do they see this as a conflict, or is resistance in that sense something totally different?
Okay, so that is a question for which the answer changes over history. And one of the things that got me interested in this term, conflict, was an interview with Ghassan Kanafani from 1970 or 1971, can't remember. And it's very famous, and an Australian interviewer is asking him, what's going on with the Civil War, referring to Black September. And Kanafani says it's not a civil war, it's a resistance, it's an anti-colonial movement. And then the interviewer is like, well, so what's going on with the conflict? And Kanafani's like, it's not a conflict. It's an anti-colonial movement fighting against a colonizing power. And the interviewer is like, so whatever. And then Kanafani's like, it's not whatever, because your questions about why we don't negotiate with the Israelis, et cetera, they only make sense in the framework of conflict. But if you, look at things from a different perspective, they no longer make sense. And he repeated several times in that interview the idea of anti-colonial resistance. He was the spokesperson for the PFLP. And the PFLP definitely saw itself as an anti-colonial resistance. In the years that have passed, the PLO still saw itself as an anti-colonial form of resistance. I think Hamas sees itself as both that and, at least some of the members of Hamas as being part of, spreading Islam in a particular, and we shouldn't ignore the idea that is there, and but we also cannot say it's not about resist, right? So it's a very complicated situation, and no one wants to talk about Hamas because, you don't want to say it's not resistance, but you also don't want to say it is resistance because it's so violent and but we can say both things. It is anti-colonial resistance, and a lot of people join Hamas because they have these feelings, and at the same time, there's also an ideology there of, spreading Islam. Like I feel like imperialism is not the right word here, but so I'm calling it this other thing, and it is uncomfortable, but we should be able to talk about it, and so it's yes and no is the answer. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
I mean, I asked you this question also in the morning, so I'm going to ask it again. I feel like there's something about emotion or affect that seems to be pushed away from the conversation or discourse. I was just wondering what we do with the term hate. I don't feel like I hear it. And it is covered by a million terminologies that work otherwise.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not the right register. I don't know. I just wonder to myself a lot what to do with this term, word, concept, or maybe something that evokes terminology altogether.
So the affective plays a huge role. It's happening currently. You were saying the book was timely, and I feel the exact opposite, because I finished writing it in the time of the before, and all of a sudden a lot of it is irrelevant. But some of it is relevant, and okay, I watched 4 seasons of Fauda. You don't have to, because I did that. And that helped me look into this. It wasn't hate as much as revenge, like the logic of revenge that seems to be completely devoid of values. Like it's just this kind of, so, if you haven't watched Fauda, it's completely around the cycle of revenge. It bounces back and forth between an undercover Arabic-speaking special unit of Mizrahi men and one woman who are fighting against Palestinian militants. And it's literally, this person kills the other's girlfriend, and so that person takes revenge by killing this person's brother. And like it's so within the logic of the blood feud, and it circulates very familial tropes. Like, at some point, one of the undercover agents tells his commander, "You're talking to your Palestinian informants as though they're your children." Another agent has an affair with, a person on the other side. So it's all like incredibly familial. And we're told that the Palestinians are motivated by, they belong to Hamas or they belong to ISIS, but we never see any ideology. There's no ideology, nothing. There's never an explanation for what they're doing, what they're doing, other than the cycle of revenge. And it's kind of the same on the Israeli side, except it's also their job. That's the other reason they do it. There are no ideological commitments. There's no point at which in the 4 seasons, there's now a 5th. That's kind of, in those 4 seasons, there's no moment where there's any explication of the values that are driving this cycle of revenge. It's just about revenge. It's about hate. It's about this, this kind of, and I felt like that was representing, especially the moment, kind of up until 3 years ago, where it felt like the ideological horizon is receding. There are fewer and fewer values. Matan Kamina wrote a thing that was called, was titled, "To Hate Arabs is Values," and he took that from an actual sign at a demonstration, where an Israeli demonstration, where a person had written on a sign, "To hate Arabs is values," is the ideology in and of itself. Like the hatred is the ideology. Like there's no need for making the desert bloom. No need for messianism. You don't need values anymore. It's just about hate. And all of this to say that your intuition is correct. There's something It's not only that. There are other things happening. The religious right, messianism. It's in itself kind of influenced by American evangelical ideas. That is happening. But at the same time, there is this weird affective level in which all of this is happening, reinforced by familial tropes, reinforced by the idea of, revenge. And it exploded since October 7th because all the repression and the disappearance that Israelis were doing to view themselves as liberals was no longer necessary. Jewish Israelis basically saw the violence that Hamas inflicted as giving them license to no longer hide their own desire for violence. And so now it's kind of out in the open, but it was always there. And Fauda is a way of saying that it was always there. 4 seasons all created before October 7th, and that kind of logic of nothing but revenge. And so I tried to understand where it was coming from, and to not just stay with the feeling. And I found something useful in Foucault, where he differentiates between two regimes of truth, which I translated to two forms of conflict because it really kind of aligns. One of them he names Oedipal or Roman, and it's the one that is juridical and assumes the third figure of the judge and arbitration, everything that I talked about with the kind of normative notion of conflict. But then he says there's another regime of truth or conflict, which he names Homeric or Germanic. Of course, they are coextensive because it's always at the same time, yes. And that other model is all about competition or the duel. There is no longer the third figure of the judge. There is no need. It's not going to establish what the truth is. It's not going to establish a new set of laws or rules. It's not interested in creating a state or two states or one state. No, none of that. It's all about proving who is right by proving who is stronger. And the logic is the logic of the trial by fire, right? The witch thing. Like if she drowns, she's a witch, whatever it was. It's, whoever wins in the duel, that person is right. And that was kind of the only useful language that I found to think about what's going on in this cycle of revenge that I saw in Fauda. And it's absolutely that. It's just about maintaining the upper hand, because winning means you're right when you have no other values there. So yeah, Foucault for the win. Sorry. Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
okay,
No, Roni's running the show.
No, let's start and then I'll go over there.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing with us your book and the ideas. I have praise and I have constructive criticism.
Sure.
I think that problematizing the notion of conflict opens up the door for some really interesting analyses. I think that is a powerful move. A bunch of discourse really happened. And I think that going into the Enlightenment era, like you do, to try to trace out Western conceptions of conflict, it's also quite insightful. It made me think of Wa'ad Halak's Impossible State, where he also does a similar move in the Enlightenment era to look at conceptions of nature and how ethics towards nature develops. So I think there's precedent there, and it opens a lot of doors. I think that then, like technical literature, which you do, I wonder if you could, adding to the Western philosophy's discussion, look at old literature like Virgil or Homer, look at the conflict there, and they would make it more in the literary realm without going into political theory and then jumping back into conflict, like staying in literature and just look, here's how conflict happens for Aeneas. Here's how conflict happens for Odysseus. And when you were just talking about Phoba, looking at in Greek tragedy and in plays and themes of revenge and identity, I'm thinking of Nova Bacchae, like Aeschylus. And maybe there could be some cool conflict things happening in that literature that you could make a similar move, that can explain some of the ages today. And I think that I've done this been done before. So that's the praise. I think thank you for opening up that door. One more kind of just comment, and then I'll give my criticism. The Mizrahim discussion is super interesting. And it made me think of Albert Memmi in his Portrait de Colonisateur, where he talks about, I think, like the Maltese cab driver in like French North Africa. And he does this triangulation move where we have the colonizer and the colonized, which we thought was a binary. But now there's this third kind of middle character, the Maltese cab driver. What's their status? But then he takes more of a class analysis. He has more of like kind of a Marxist bend almost. He's looking in terms of bourgeois and proletariat, which you don't really do here. But I think that maybe this question of this, because also in the same way they're trying to not de-dichotomize the conflict, that's what Memi is doing of making it not bourgeoisie and proletariat and adding a third category. But I also think that if you do that, you have to talk about whiteness, which you don't talk about whiteness in the book. And that was like, we're talking about Mizrahim and kind of the Ashken normativity of Zionism, like whiteness might come into the discussion if we're going to talk about the Mizrahim and we might be ignoring something. So that's constructive. And then my final sort of criticism, this is probably the thing that was most pertinent, was I think the cover of the book belies the message of the book. Because like, do you guys have the cover there? Can you hold it up? Because the central thesis of the book is that it's not a conflict. The title of the talk is beyond conflict, but the title of the book is just conflicts. And the main argument is that it's not a conflict because Israel and Palestine aren't symmetrical, but the font, if you hold that up again, sorry, the font is exactly the same. It shows Israel and Palestine is the same size.
No, Palestine is bigger.
Palestine is bigger.
It's longer, but it's not bigger.
Yeah.
And so I think that if I was a passerby in Barnes and Noble, let's say this is a book about the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Okay, I'm going to
So
start
that's
from
a
the
good
end
concept.
and tell you that the press would not change the cover. You know, that's just the way things work.
Yeah, that's that. And then in the introduction, you're saying, I don't want to use the term Israel-Palestine, but then you do anyway.
Yes.
You know? I want to ask you about that is can you talk about that stuff?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start from the end. Yes, in terms of the actual visuals of the cover, I hate it. I tried to change it. The press will not change it. The title being conflict was also kind of, it was a at some point the editor said maybe add a question mark. And I told him I feel like it being in the plural is already a way, of saying I am not accepting the term conflict, but I am interested in conflictuality and in different modes of conflictuality. I mean, conflictuality would have made for a really annoying title, so I tried to keep it simple. Okay, what else? Oh my God. But the first comment, I wrote down the other ones, but I forgot where you started.
The old literature was
Yes. Okay. So I love, that you're going to different periods. It is the equivalent of not working on Europe, for instance, or the West. And I really, there are great works of scholarship being done on the classics, and it's just not my field. So I have two answers for you here. One is that all scholars tend to look for the key under the lamppost. I am trained in certain things. I'm not trained as a classicist, and so I there are certain things I can do and certain things I cannot do. I also, and here's the second part, I also feel like we don't have an unmediated kind of access to these works. So our perception of Antigone and our perception of, Oedipus is already a Hegelian one that, there's no way for us to know what, a Greek audience saw in the play at the time. And I feel like a lot of the things I'm getting at when I look at the Enlightenment are not unrelated to Hegel's reading of Antigone. So, for instance, I just mentioned Foucault's two things that he calls Homeric and Oedipal. But Hegel's reading of Antigone is that this is the transition from, divine law, the feud, competition, trial by fire, the proof is in the pudding kind of thing, to the logic of the law and the state and the sovereign. And, Antigone is divine law and Creon is state and, common law. Do we have an unmediated? I don't know. So in a sense, this is already kind of there in the Enlightenment. Oh my God, Mimi. Yes, he also has a portrait of a Jew. And he also wrote about being an Arab Jew. And weirdly enough, there, he's not seeing a third figure. He doesn't triangulate. He ends up on a Zionist note, and he's kind of disappointing. Like after you read like Portrait of
He changes.
yes, but like the Portrait of the Colonizer is particularly strong. Like it's such a great work. It's so useful. Like the colonizer who refuses. I think it's the second chapter. It's just so helpful for questions of like criticism, complicity. Is there dissent? Is there no dissent? And then you get to like Portrait of a Jew, and it's just like nah.
And it's also the severances that starts there. I mean, the severance between Muslims and Jews of Algeria.
Yes,
It's
right.
in the colonial period of the Crimea Decree in
Exactly,
1870 to give citizenship only to.
Yes.
So that's a whole history that, I mean, he theorizes it but doesn't mention that history.
Yeah.
It moves and
Yeah.
leaves it behind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really disappointing on that particular note. And whiteness. Sorry.
Maybe
Okay, we'll get to whiteness.
yeah, you'll do a whiteness thing later. Maybe just conclude with the last question and
I just thank you so much for your talk. It was really wonderful, and I actually work in like Latin American literature, and so the figuring of disappearance as a kind of was really interesting to me
so much
because of the kind of the desaparecidos and ongoing movement in Chile, Argentina, and beyond to kind of keep this eternal image of disappearance, like the figure of disappearance that kind of constantly vanishes and reappears as an act of protest and as one of the main kind of icons that seems to transmit internationally. And I was connecting that a little bit to the kind of everyday life coming out from these reporters, these citizen reporters, or like I think one of the things that is mobilizing so many people who don't know about the about Palestine in the US and on campuses is just this encounter with the everyday, and not just the everyday of but like everyday disappearance, like that you're following somebody and then they're gone. And there's a kind of visual, like a horrible visual media enactment on your phone of this disappearance. And I think it's like extremely galvanizing for solidarity.
Right, yes.
And really emotional for
Right. This reporter has disappeared for 5 days, right? And
Yes.
we're waiting.
Yeah, exactly. Or this, lifestyle guy has been killed. Like that kind of like. So I guess my question is like, how can we keep this powerful? You have to kind of do that work of disappearance inside and outside, like to kind of keep the Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo, keep the disappeared like they keep them in the eye. There's work there of like continuing the work. So how can we do the work to keep this kind of disappearance present? And then is there like a danger of not understanding the context if only the image of loss is appearing? And like how can we use that image, harness it, but also, I don't know, like what is your take on that maybe?
Yeah. Okay, that is a huge question. But again, starting from the end, I think one of the things to do with those accounts, with those online accounts, is to go back to before the war and see the everyday life in Gaza that people are completely unaware of. Yes, those influencers, they used to do this, here is me opening my package of my new makeup. Like, I don't know, just normal stuff. And I think, not staying with only the sensational and only the void and only the disappearance, but scrolling back is one way of making things present. And I think one of the issues with Gaza is the sensationalizing. And, yes, it galvanizes support, but it's also, it exceptionalizes it in a way that is kind of, I mean, if it's such a heterotopia, if it's so different, if it's so, so violent, then in a sense that normalizes for us the idea that people just disappear there or die there. So this is why I'm saying, like, to counter this by looking at some really boring stuff of people unwrapping, like
To everyday.
yes,
Yeah.
and disappearance is huge in Latin America, and there are definitely resonances. One is also the affair of the disappeared Jewish Yemenite children. So there's an affair of disappearance in Israel that happened like in the early 50s, where one of every 6 Yemenite Jewish kids disappeared, and the word disappearance is also kind of attributed to that affair, and that actually resonates more with those kinds of disappearances. I can talk about disappearance for days, but yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, I think this was maybe to wrap up, but just actually a great way to conclude, because of thinking about the potentialities of these figurations that are born in a specific place and time. To theorize from within, to theorize from the context, use the larger frameworks when they are relevant, and teasing out a kind of a different modality for thinking and understanding what's going on, and then also thinking about their potential, functioning as a currency that is perhaps helpful in thinking about other contexts as well. So in this context, Latin America. But I just want to say thank you, and good evening to everyone, and thank you especially
Thanks for the amazing questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.